And so the second part of your book is the raw materials of
Right.
language acquisition, which
Mhm.
you have under two headings of input and output.
Right.
So this is just now we're talking about just implicit knowledge.
Right.
What are the unique roles of language input and output, and what are language input and output? To begin with.
Sure, sure. So language is comprised of four skills: speaking, listening, reading, writing. And so the input skills are listening and reading, the output skills are speaking and writing. Now, in terms of input, it is just essential. Everybody in SLA is talking about input, and specifically comprehensible input, as being what is essential for acquisition, because you can get a huge amount of input. Just go online and listen to somebody in another language. But if it's not comprehensible, you're not going to get anything out of it. And you're not going to start learning the language that way. You need input that you can understand. And Creation's input hypothesis has really kind of set the target for SLA research. Everybody's looking at, how do you do this? The input hypothesis says that learners are going to learn the best if they have input that is 1 degree more difficult than their current level. Okay. Now, everybody's got their ideas of what 1 degree means, but this idea that you have input that's comprehensible but has just a little bit more that you don't know, then you can acquire it. And so there's been all kinds of research being done about, how do you do that? How do you make the input comprehensible? How do you add comprehensible input? How do you change the quality of the input so it's not just comprehensible, but so that you can derive the most intake from that input possible? So input it's just essential for language acquisition. And on a very basic level, I mean, it's just common sense. If you've never heard the word sombrero, you're never going to acquire sombrero in your language. But the types of input and how it's delivered and how you work with it, that's so much of what's being done in SLA research right now. And just as I said, everybody, I don't think there's anybody who would disagree that it's just essential for
Yeah,
acquisition.
yeah, I think that's a really important point. That is, it's easy. I mean, you say it's obvious, right? That if you don't hear the word sombrero, you can't learn the word sombrero.
Mhm.
But the point of that is, in order to progress in the language, you have to come into contact with new native speaker input. And there's really no getting around that.
Right.
And so that means that, like, this is one of the reasons why extensive reading, for example, is so important,
Mhm.
because you just want as much input as you possibly can get. And that's one really good way to do it. It's just read as much as you possibly can. Obviously, the problem is, and I think this is where my feeling on some of the trends within biblical studies is that the comprehensible part isn't always given enough attention.
Right.
So,
Right.
if I have a total immersion class, the big question is, like, they're getting a lot of input, which is great. The
Mhm.
big question is, how much is everyone understanding? A lot of times, I mean, in the classes that I've sat in on, or that I've actually done, there's some people that understand most of what's going on, and
Mhm.
some people that don't really understand anything. They will say after, I have no idea what just happened to me, you know, which is like, okay, for those people, they didn't really progress, right?
Right. Right.
And then the problem is that there then becomes this ever widening gap,
Mhm.
because the people that comprehended it did progress, and the people that
Right.
didn't comprehend it didn't progress.
And it builds on itself. So if you get lost, anything else that comes after, you're lost.
Right. Yes, I completely agree. I think that's a really important point to the I+1, is what Krashen's formula. So output, that's input. So we know we
Mhm.
we need input for progression in the language.
Could I go back
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to input?
yeah.
One point you made that I think is really important is that it's native speaker input, or at least meaning bearing input. In other words, we're not talking paradigms, we're not talking isolated forms, we're talking actual sentences and stories, and not the grammar memorization, but actual language being used for what it's supposed to be used for, which is communication.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And you're right too that I would be a total hypocrite to say only native speaker input would count, because we have a lot of stories in Biblingo of, just like baby Hebrew and
Right,
Greek,
right, right,
because you can't read full native
right.
speaker input. It's just like, that's what it is. But the assumption is that even that input would not be introducing errors, or that you could move beyond those at later stages. just to point out that like you need accurate input,
That's
to acquire that language.
that's right.
Um, but yeah, native speaker would be too strong. So output, why is this important? Especially given that the only thing we have in terms of the biblical languages is input, right?
Right.
We have texts with which we can get input,
Hmm.
but we don't have a speaker to practice on for output. And I know obviously some people speak the biblical languages, like
Right, right,
I'm
right.
one of them that could, carry on some conversation in it, but it's not the same again as a native speaker.
Yes.
For linguists, none of us would count as real native speakers of that language, no matter how good your intuitions are, So
Right.
tell us about output.
Well, output really is important for language acquisition for several reasons. So, one of them is once you've gotten your input, you've gotten it into your brain, you've processed it, the only way to know for you or your teacher or whoever wants to know whether you've actually acquired it is if you can produce it. Nobody can get inside your brain and see, did you actually learn it or not? Until you produced output, then you know that you've acquired it. Otherwise, it's just rattling around in there and nobody's sure. And so it's really helpful for both learners and teachers if you can produce that output to go, oh, yes, you got this, but not that. Or you've got the general idea, but it needs to be refined a little more, that kind of thing. And so that's one reason why output really is important. Another reason, and this is related, it gives the teacher the opportunity for very focused feedback. In other words, if the learner produces something, it's incorrect, the teacher can go, oh, that's what we're missing, and go back and reteach or provide more practice in that area. But more than that, the people in SLA will tell us that you need not just input, but you also need interaction for acquisition to occur. You can get all kinds of input, but if you don't do something with it, and particularly communicate, then you're not going to be as effective at learning. And of course, communication requires two people. One of them has to produce output and one input to dialogue in the language. And so it's necessary for that aspect as well. And not only that, but in the context of that, and this is, I think, part of why they say that this interaction is important, is because you can adjust in real time. In a conversation, you can make the adjustments needed to comprehend. And so if one person's saying something, the other person does not understand it, they can say, wait, stop, slow down, say it again, and right there on the spot can change, adjust, create comprehensible input if it was incomprehensible, and make the adjustments on the spot so that very quickly you can get what you need to learn, to acquire, to understand, because comprehension is part of what fuels, and the need for comprehension, part of what fuels acquisition.
So these are all things I feel like, again, if you were to argue for learning French, okay, I can understand we need output. What about for the biblical languages where we don't have anyone to talk to? My understanding of what you're saying is that basically output serves input in this case, because I don't actually need to have a conversation with anyone in biblical Greek or Hebrew because there is no one to talk to. That's a native speaker, you
Right.
know, but I do have native speaker written material, right, that I want to interact with. And so what I'm hearing you say is including output is the best way to access that native speaker written material in a meaningful way. Is that
Yes, absolutely. I would totally agree with that.
so?
That
Not necessarily the case that like we wouldn't necessarily say, okay, I just want to be able to say, can I go to the bathroom in biblical Hebrew, right? Like,
right.
and I don't need to have that conversation with someone.
Mhm,
But if I practice the language using these
mhm.
kinds of methods, then
Right.
I will have a better shot at understanding a written text.
Right, absolutely. And another thing which I didn't mention is having to produce output forces you to learn the language more deeply. You can recognize, oh, they're saying, hello, how are you? But if I have to produce hello, how are you? I have to think through what exactly is the form I need? How do I need to use it? And that act of producing is going to dig it in deeper in a way that just reading it would not.
Yeah, I agree. And so I took, Greek and Hebrew at the Police Institute,
Oh,
and
wow.
Eyal Nahum is the Hebrew teacher there.
Okay.
And we would go back and forth and say, like, how do you say I agree in biblical Hebrew? Like, this is something that, like, it's actually pretty hard. There's like Tov Harava Be'enai is like kind of that, but
Right.
there's not really a good
They don't have a yes.
example. Oh, there's no yes for sure. There's no yes for sure. But like something like, yeah, just like a word for agree also is like not, there's not a really good word
Right.
for it. And there could have been, right? Probably. It's some, like, I'm sure we know that there was a situation where something like that would have need to
Right.
be communicated,
Right.
but it's just really hard to know what exactly would they have said. And when you start asking those questions, it
Right.
actually does give you a new window into the text, right? Because you're saying,
Absolutely.
you're being very careful about, like, okay, what did they actually mean by these words, right? Did they mean
Right.
I agree, or did they mean something else? Which again, it's a different way to think about it. And to your point, I think much more accurate. So what about writing? Basically, we just focus on speaking, right?
Right. Right.
In terms of output. I think there's a lot of unique benefits to writing specifically for reading, but can you
Mhm.
tell us why should we include writing in our biblical language classrooms?
Right. Well, in addition to the things we've already talked about with speaking, it promotes accuracy, it promotes depth of knowledge, it gives you the opportunity to do some interaction, even though it's a little more separated by time and space. If you write letters, you have to wait a little while to get a response or to know if the person understood you or not. But in addition, when you write, you have a little more freedom to think about what you want to say. You lose the pressure of, oh, I got to give a response right now, where you have some space to really think about it, to formulate, to create, and you lose the intimidation factor of having to speak it and produce it in real time.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Which can be I mean, it's really hard part of learning any language. I'm on the spot and I have to respond to you and you're speaking really fast, that kind of thing.
Right.
One other point that I think is important is spelling really helps you to read more quickly and being able to recognize letters very, very quick
Hmm.
is really important for reading. And the best way to do that is to do the harder skill, right? Is
Hmm.
to write and use letters, produce letters yourself in ways that correspond to the correct sound.